This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
Welcome to the Superhero Leadership Podcast, hosted by former CEO of Marvel Entertainment, Peter Cuneo. Listen as he explores outstanding leadership through the lens of successful superhero leaders. Here's your host, Peter Cuneo.
Today's guest on Superhero Leadership is a trailblazer in public service, historical stewardship, and leadership under scrutiny. Dr. Colleen Shogan made history as the first woman confirmed as the Archivist of the United States, where she led the National Archives through one of the most politically charged periods in recent memory. Before that, she served as director of the David M. Rubenstein Center for White House History, and she held senior roles at the Library of Congress, the Congressional Research Service, and on commissions marking milestones like the Women's Suffrage Centennial. A Yale-educated scholar, best-selling mystery author, and first-generation college graduate, Colleen brings both intellectual depth and personal grit to every role she takes on. Today, we'll talk about what it means to lead with integrity, how to stay focused when the political winds swarm around you, and what leadership looks like when the stakes include the very preservation of our democracy. Colleen, so happy to have you with us today.
I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you. And it's going to be a lot of fun. There's some things today that are a little bit different than what we do. Today we're talking about leadership in public institutions and politics and what have you. Those are areas we haven't covered so much. And in your case, that leadership encompasses what we also call thought leadership. There may not have been hundreds of thousands of people working for you directly in some cases. In some cases, there were quite a few, but also thought leadership and how important that is. We usually start, though, by asking people about how they grew up. What was it like being young? What planted the seeds for learning the instincts of leadership in your case? Because we do see when we talk to people a lot of parallels about early life and their personal and professional experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I grew up in a town called North Huntington. It was coupled with another town called Irwin, about 15, 17 miles outside of Pittsburgh, east of Pittsburgh. And if you ever drive on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, you go past the Irwin exit. So a lot of people know it as Irwin. That's why I usually mention it. And it is a working class suburb outside of Pittsburgh. It's a diverse place in that there were many, many immigrants, mostly Eastern European, but from many different places that I grew up, in fact, right next to me. I have first-generation Americans grew up next to me, which was really formative for me. My parents were very good people. I would not say we were super wealthy, but we certainly, I hit the jackpot with them. I hit the lottery because they were very focused on education. Neither of them went to college, but they really put a premium on myself and my brother to go to college. And I had a little bit of an unusual upbringing because my brother is 12 years older than me, and there's no children in between. So there was a decision made early on, I don't know, by my mom or my dad or both of them, that you can imagine growing up that you really can't have two conversations going at once with like a 5-year-old and a 17-year-old. You really just have to have one conversation. And for whatever reason, they defaulted to my brother. The conversations were kind of adult, level conversations that you would have with a high schooler. And I had to follow along. And I think that was one of the things that I learned really early on was the value of listening, because I didn't understand everything that was going on. You can imagine why that would be the case. But I found that if I kind of listened really well and paid attention, that after a while I could patch things together and I understood a lot. I remember when I was 4 years old, the Iran hostage crisis was going on. And it was, I'm sure dominated the news in the United States in 1979. And I remember that because the TV was always on and they were talking about it. And of course, my parents talked about it with my brother. And I listened to those conversations and I understood, probably not all the intricacies, but I understood what was going on and why that was important and why they were concerned. So it was, I think, a terrific childhood. I was academically focused. My dad liked history. He was a draftsman, so he was not a historian or did not work in the history field. But when we would travel locally and when we would go places for vacation, he always wanted to go to history sites. So at a very young age, I went to Gettysburg with him, and then we would couple that with going to Hershey Park. So he exposed me to the value of understanding history in its firsthand experience of history and how that comes alive. When we went to Virginia Beach, we went to Yorktown to understand what happened at Yorktown. So those were very formative experiences for me. And then I played a lot of sports. And I know from listening to this podcast that you have a number of people that are leaders in sports and in the sports industry. And I'd never played on the professional level, and I didn't play actually in college except for fun, for intramurals. But I played a lot of sports growing up and at the high school level. And I had the privilege of playing for, this is kind of a fun fact about me, I played for the female high school coach who has the most successful, most winningest record in American history. So her name is Sharon Watson. She was a volleyball coach at my high school, and she is in all the Sports Hall of Fame. She's been in Sports Illustrated because she is the most successful female high school coach in American history. So I learned a lot from playing volleyball for Sharon Watson, for sure.
Great. PeterCuneo.com is my website and talks about leadership and so on. If the audience wants to go and look at that, I do have a list of 15 different things that I recommend for young people to learn leadership. And one is team sports. And I have performing arts as well, which I consider a team sport. Disparate people getting together with one common goal, and whether it's successful or not. A lot of working with different people, different types, diversity, and I think it's a great experience for young people. Sounds like it really worked for you as well.
Absolutely. It taught me two things, I think: how to win gracefully. I remember once, this is a funny story, I was on the softball field and we won a really close game. And after we won, I, was celebrating with my teammates and probably celebrating a little bit too much, but I don't know, I was probably 12 or 13 years old or something like that. And when I got in the car to go home with my dad, he said, you kind of celebrated a little bit too much after that game. And I said, why? What's wrong with that? We won and it was a close game and we played really well. Why is that such a bad thing? He said, you really shouldn't act like that. He said, it's better just to walk off the field after you win. He said, then people will look at you and say, oh, she's not really that excited. She wins all the time. He said, so it's much better to win in that way, win gracefully. And I always remembered that's really important. And then, of course, the other side of it is you learn also how to lose. And you also learn that there's always going to be people who in some ways are a little bit more talented than you, a little bit better than you. I played against some women in Pennsylvania sports that, went on to play Olympic level sports. And believe me, when you play against someone of that caliber, you understand, okay, I might be okay, but this person is really amazing. And that kind of is humbling in a way, and it's good for you.
Sure. I want to jump to your role at the National Archives. So let me explain for our audience very briefly, and some of them know from past conversations with other people. I've been on the board of the National Archives Foundation for about 14 years. Another thing you'd find on my list of 15 things for young people is study history, because I believe very strongly you learn a lot about leadership by studying past leaders. I've really enjoyed my time on the archives very much. This is, again, the foundation. The foundation is separate, if you will, from the Archives Department of the United States, which you headed. The foundation exists really just to raise money to fund projects that the U.S. government doesn't have the budget for. Projects that the archives puts together. These can be exhibitions. These can be discussion sessions at the archives on history and so on, that help educate Americans on our history. There's no doubt about it that I feel very strongly that particularly young people do not understand our history. Unfortunately, we don't teach civics in public schools anymore, which is staggering to me. So they don't even understand how our government is organized, and now we ask them to vote on very important elections. It's a real problem. But I'm very proud of the work that we do, again, as a separate foundation, raising money to help out, as we did with you on a number of things. You were in that job for about a year?
A year and 9 months.
Okay. And in the end, for political reasons, you basically were fired by our president for no particular reason that I can think of, except he's mad at the archives for some things that happened with him prior, with different leadership, the whole thing. I'm really interested in what you see as the differences in leadership that are required when one is heading up a public institution rather than a for-profit entity.
Before coming to the National Archives, I worked at a number of other like-minded public institutions. I worked at the Library of Congress for many years, including the Congressional Research Service. I worked for the nonprofit, the White House Historical Association, which works alongside whoever is in the White House for the preservation of the White House and sharing of that history, and then came to the National Archives. And I think when you work at a public institution, a federal institution, which those all were, even White House Historical, because it worked alongside the White House, it's really important that you engage in a nonpartisan manner without, and that is not the place. There are other places in Washington, D.C., in fact, all around Washington, D.C., in which it's appropriate to engage in partisan leadership or ideological leadership. But in those institutions, it was my strong belief that you should not when you're leading them. And in fact, your approach to leadership should be nonpartisan, and how you do your job, how you actually execute that job, is done in a bipartisan manner. So it was very important to me, no matter what we were doing that was public-facing, to make sure that when we were providing access to the records of the United States for people to learn about American history or learn about their own personal history or their local history, the history of their family, their ancestry, things like that, that it was I would approach it with the lightest touch possible, because it was our job to provide access to the records. Then we enable Americans to then draw their own conclusions about what those records mean and what that tells them about the trajectory of American history.
I always, as I said, I think that the archives is America's best kept secret. Not that it's a secret by choice. The archives has, what is it now, 22 billion documents?
13.5 billion.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm a little high, but still, it's in the billions.
Yes. Well, that's just the paper documents. So there's be more on electronic. So
that's maybe we get to my 22 when you add digital to it.
Absolutely.
And maybe the largest collection of antique maps in the world, largest collection of film, largest collection of photographs in the world, housed in 40 plus locations around the United States. Archives is also very supportive of presidential libraries, of which there are many, and what have you, and people just don't realize. And the Archives is a new institution, so to speak, formed only, I think, in the 1930s.
Right, under FDR.
Okay, because prior to that, all the records of our history were kept in various places, kept very poorly, One of the reasons our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, the original copies, are fading is because they were kept on a wall in the sun for 100 years and so on. So the government rightly understood that, no, these documents have tremendous value and we need to treat them right. I encourage anyone in the audience that when they come to Washington, D.C., you must go to the archives. You will really enjoy it. There's always exciting exhibitions ongoing. There's actually a terrific store there as well, where you can buy lots of different things related to our history, which I think if you're interested in history, it's the place to go, and so on. So
absolutely, it's a terrific institution.
Yeah. So we'll continue our conversation with Colleen right after this short break.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
One of the personal stories I have to talk about involves getting my father's military records from the archives. And I think they're all kept in the St. Louis location, if I'm correct. And Colleen, when you came on as archivist, you were hit with the fact that there were 300,000 requests from our citizens for the records of their own records or the records of people in the family and so on that had not been filled. A tremendous backup. How did you handle that?
I knew coming into the job that this was the biggest discrete problem that I faced, that had to be solved in a short amount of time as possible. Before I even was confirmed, I had told people at the archives that this was what I was going to be focused on. And as soon as I came on board, then I was legally allowed to plan a trip to St. Louis. And I think really the next day that after I started, they went to get my travel approved, to get me booked on a plane. And there's certain things you have to do in the government before you can travel. And I think I was on a plane less than 2 weeks later to go to St. Louis. And it was really important for me. They said, well, we can talk to the director of, it's the National Personnel Records Center, NPRC in St. Louis. You can talk to him on Zoom or Google Meets. And I said, well, that's fine, but I don't just want to talk to him. I want to go there, and I need to see what's going on and actually meet the people, not just the leaders, but actually the people that are doing the work. And they need to explain to me how this functions. Because you just don't, you can understand a problem from reading a description of it on a piece of paper and have people brief you, but it's much different to see a problem right in front of you and actually go. And
Colleen, I have to just interrupt you for a second, because what you're describing is something we also like to talk about here. When we describe effective leaders go and learn in depth what's going on, what it really takes for their people to do their job, to understand the job and the challenges of those jobs and see them in action. So I really appreciate what you're saying about getting involved almost instantly.
Yes.
It's great.
And I think I spent a day and a half or 2 days there, and they took me. I said, listen, this is what I want to do. I want you to show me throughout the building, which is a pretty, sizable building, all the military records are stored there. I want you to show me when a request comes in from a service member, from a veteran or a family member, I want to know, where does that request go? How do you fulfill this request? And show me like an easy request, that's just for the DD-214 or whatever, is pretty simple to fulfill. But then show me a request that's a little bit harder, that's more complicated, where you have to do more research, and take me to an archivist that's actually helping with a more complex request as well as one that's more easily fulfilled. And so they did all that and walked me all over the building. I got to meet all the different teams. I followed a request, and then I met with all the teams and talked to everyone. And, basically did a little bit of a cheerleader act too, because I said, listen, we're going to have to keep up with the requests that are coming in is one thing, but then you have a 300,000 backlogs. That means we've got to do 300,000 requests worth of work while still keeping up with the day-to-day work. And that's the only way to do that is we could hire up, we could hire more people, which we were able to do because Congress had supported us to be able to do that. But we also are going to need to do overtime, for people so that we can keep this facility running, second shift. We can keep this facility running on Saturdays, on holidays, and we're able to support people that want to come in and do this work. But it's going to be very important. We're going to have incentive pay, bonuses for people that fulfill a certain number of requests because, we have archivist technicians that have to go out into these huge facilities of stacks and stacks of records to be able to go and locate that paper record, pull it off the shelf, and bring it back, and then have it scanned, and then have it transmitted to respond to the particular request that has come in. So there's truly a physical element to this job as well. And I said, if you are able to do that, you handle this on your end, I will make sure that you don't have any problems from like the National Archives level per se that could frustrate your ability to make progress or impede your progress. And there were some of those problems, including internet connectivity. We were finishing, this is such a pedestrian thing, but we were finishing a contract with a particular internet service provider who was not providing the best internet service for all of the archives. And the internet was going down, I would say once a week at a lot of our facilities. And the way that it was set up, if it went down at one of our main facilities, the internet service provider ran through our College Park location. So if that would go out, that meant that St. Louis would go out too because of how the connections were organized. We changed that under my leadership. But at that point in time, that's how it was. And I remember that it went down and it was in the summer, and we only had about a week or 10 days left on this contract before we were going to switch over to what I thought was going to be a more reliable provider. And they were just not being responsive to us to put it back on because why would they? We were terminating the contract, right? So I said, I want to talk to the highest person that I can possibly speak with in this company. And I think they ended up putting me on with a senior VP. I said I wanted to talk to the CEO. I think they put me on with a very, very high-level senior VP, and I was on the video with her. I said, listen, this is how this is going to go. If you don't get this up and running, I'm going to contact everybody over in Congress. I'm going to contact the chair and the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee and Senate Government Affairs and Homeland Security and Government Affairs. There are two oversight committees. And I'm going to tell them that you are impeding our progress. And the reason why we're not getting these requests done is because of your company. And I'm going to give them your name and your email. And I'm going to say, it's not me. This is what it is. And she said, well, that sounds like a threat to me. I said, I don't think it's a threat. I said, it's just what I'm going to do. I said, I wouldn't put it as a threat. I think it's just exactly what I'm going to do if this internet's not turned back on and in a timely fashion. And it was on within a few hours. So sometimes you just have to stand up. And I had promised the staff in St. Louis and the leadership in the St. Louis facility that if something like that happened, that I would be the one to run interference for them. They were keeping up with their end of the bargain, so I certainly had to keep up with mine.
Colleen, another one of the principles that we talk about, and we have this list on petercuneo.com as well, which is we call 32 Essentials of Superhero Leadership. Mm-hmm. And one of them that I get a lot of comment on says, be ruthless when called for. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I love this story you just told because it's exactly what I'm trying to get across. Right. They were screwing the Americans. They were screwing basically all Americans. Right. That's simple.
Right. And I know they probably didn't know what they were doing that was going to affect veterans, but I explained the whole problem and they said, listen, this is a big deal. You don't want this heat.
No.
And it turned out they did not.
No. Well, I obviously think you did exactly the right thing. And hopefully they learned something, got a lesson from it. Very interesting. And finally, you did get the backlog
Yes, we
caught up?
did. Yes.
How long did that take?
Only about a year.
Okay.
Only about
still.
a year. It was exactly in the time frame that we had predicted. Everything stayed exactly as the plan was written, and I would check the numbers every week. I had a weekly report that came to me personally, not to one of my senior people or anything. It came right to my inbox. I would print out the report. I would look at it, and I would look at the number that we got done, and look at the target where we were supposed to be. And if we fell off in a particular week, which sometimes there was a little bit of a fall off, I would immediately email our leadership in St. Louis and say, hey, what's going on here? Why were we 5,000 requests off or 2,000 requests off? And there was always an explanation for why it was, and say, okay, well, how are we going to get those back so that we can get back on track? And then there was there would be another plan for that.
You brought, and all the people in St. Louis that were working on this probably created a lot of happiness for a lot of American families when they finally got these records. Basically learned a lot more about their loved ones.
Yes,
than they knew before.
And in some cases, they're really important because laws change all the time. And, so the shift about benefits that are due to veterans, if they've experienced certain conditions in their service, then they might be entitled to additional benefits. And when those laws change, you need the records to be able to prove it.
I'll be back in a moment with more of Superhero Leadership. Stay with us.
So, you just started using LinkedIn Premium. Now what? Well, on your premium company page, you noticed around 7.5 times more page engagement and 5 times more page views. Well done. And now, new clients are messaging you. All because you're using LinkedIn Premium, which helps you get the business growth you want. Think big, small business. Think big. Start your free trial at linkedin.com/premium small business. That's linkedin.com/premium small business.
So is it fair to call you a presidential scholar, historian?
Yes. I'm a political scientist, so I'm not a historian, but that was my area of expertise.
That's
was
what
the
I
presidency.
thought. Yeah, okay. So can I ask you a question? Can I ask you to name your top 5 presidents out of our history?
Sure.
Who would you come up with? And I know we all know some you're going to come up with, but I'm suspecting maybe 1 or 2 surprises.
I get asked this question with some frequency, and sometimes, it can depend on the day how I answer it a little bit, but I never waver. I think you have to. Every person's list is going to include George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and you just have to, because Washington, his service to the country, and most notably, actually, the fact that he resigned and rejected power at really critical moments. He resigned his commission in the Revolutionary War even before he becomes president. Then he serves 2 terms, and then he walks away and returns back to Mount Vernon. Both of these actions are incredibly important for American history.
Do you feel it's true? And I have read this, and I've read a bio of most of the presidents, inch-thick books on this. He could have theoretically been the king of the United States of America if he wanted to be. When the government was being formed, he was that popular and that powerful.
Incredibly popular. Yes. And I think there were people who wanted him to be the king, even though they had fought a revolution to throw off a particular king. Some weren't adverse to monarchy itself. They just didn't like George III or George III's ministers. And once they were rid of him, they thought, well, okay, we can, George Washington will be a good substitute. And this was not why George Washington, however, fought the war. And he was very clear-minded about it. And I know this is one of your leadership principles as well. You have to be clear-minded about certain principles so that when you are confronted with these types of moral quandaries, that you can actually act decisively, and he did. Never a second guess in his mind. And then, of course, Lincoln, who saves the republic and really refounds the republic. There's really no more important president than Abraham Lincoln, and many, many books have been written on Lincoln, and many more books are still being written about Lincoln because people still find new facets of his leadership and his thought leadership and his ethos that people want to study and think about. And then after that, I think everything gets a little bit subjective, and you can talk about all kinds of different presidents. But I have a whole bunch of different presidents, not necessarily for their entire presidency, but for things that they, approaches to leadership that I thought were interesting. I talk about Polk, and Polk is just, he was a president ahead of his time, Polk. He wanted to pursue war. Obviously was during the time of the Mexican War, but he also wanted to reduce tariffs at the time. And those two things don't really go along. If you want to fund a war, but you want to reduce tariffs, well, how do you do that? And Polk was extraordinarily led on concerning the budget. And presidents at that time frame just they weren't involved with the budget the way that presidents are today. Polk was a good 80 years ahead of his time. He was managing the budget at the level that we don't see until the 1920s in the United States. And he understood that the president's leadership of the budget was important because in some ways, budget was policy, right? The two things were equated with each other. And people left to go home. Washington, D.C. was a very unpleasant place to be in back then. No air conditioning. Everybody left for the summer. Congress was adjourned, all these other things. And Polk stayed. He didn't go. He didn't leave. He stayed. And he would make these heads of bureaus come before him and justify their budget. And they weren't allowed to sit down. They had to stand. And he was sitting at his desk. And he would go through their budget line by line. Can you imagine the president doing this? And interrogate them. It was like his own little private committee hearing that he would have. And he would basically break them down until they agreed to what number he wanted them to be at. So once again, he could achieve his two goals of continuing the war and then also reducing the tariff.
Compare that to what we're going through right now with Doge. Different approach.
Different approach.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and Polk did his homework too. You read his diary, and I when I was doing some dissertation research, although this didn't actually end up in my dissertation research, I came across Polk's diary, and it was fascinating because he kept really careful accounts of these interactions. And he didn't go into this blindly. He knew what he was talking about. When you came in front of him, you better be prepared. So that was just extraordinary to me. I always when I learned that story, I just always kept it in the back of my mind. I'm a big fan of Ulysses S. Grant. All the time I was at the archives, I talked about Grant. We would bring out a lot of Grant records because I think Grant is one of the biggest mysteries in American history. And I've talked to some of our great biographers of Grant, Ron Chernow, Ron White, and I've asked them the same question. How did this man who was selling firewood outside of St. Louis and barely could make enough money to put food on the table to support his family, how does, in a few short years later, how is he becoming, the most powerful man in the Army of the United States? There's not really a great answer to that because no one, you can have different guesses about it. Like there was always leadership within Grant. It just hadn't come out. These were the right scenario. He had training as a quartermaster when he had served in the military earlier in his career after he went to West Point. And so he learned a lot about supply chain and how to plan ahead in a war. So some of that quartermaster training probably really came in handy whenever he was leading troops in the Civil War. So there's a lot of different answers to it, but I still think Grant is one of our biggest mysteries. And just what an amazing happenstance that Lincoln was able to find Grant, the right person for the right time. Not that the Union wouldn't have won the war, but it would have gone on, I think, a lot longer if you don't have the leadership of Grant.
Well, Lincoln couldn't find a general that wanted to fight wanted to fight but couldn't win. Right. Until Grant, basically.
Right.
And Grant wanted to fight. And Grant reminds me of if, again, we talked about history and looking at past leaders, not just in the military, but people have their moments when they are great. There are situations they're confronted with, they're not very good. It has to do with applying someone's great traits in just the right circumstances. I like to talk about Winston Churchill. Churchill, his moment was to lead the British Empire in World War II. he got thrown out after the war, and he certainly had his negative moments as well. I think no leaders are perfect. And we can always find those situations, but if they're given their moment, they rise to heights that we can hardly even contemplate.
There's a lot in Grant's presidency that people find fault in, and there's those things are true. Some of the ethics scandals, but he also waged a war against the Ku Klux Klan. And if Grant's trajectory had continued, we would have a very different history in the United States concerning civil rights and voting rights with African Americans. I mean, Grant believed in this full citizenship, voting rights, civil rights for African Americans, and the trajectory the United States was on after Grant was the correct one. And it's really a shame that was not continued. But he killed the Klan really through his prosecution of them in court and through legislation. And then I talk about different people as the number 5, but I talked a lot about Gerald Ford too, and I've talked about it because I think Ford did what he thought was an incredible self-sacrificing act when he pardoned Richard Nixon after he becomes president. He doesn't expect to become president. This is thrust upon him. Some people call him an accidental president, but he's the president nonetheless. And he faces this fractured country that has undergone this national tragedy and turmoil after Watergate. And he figures out the one thing that he can do is to try to mitigate it or end it. And he knows pretty much when he signs that pardon that he's most likely signing away the end of his political career, that it will be very, very difficult for him to run for election in his own right. But he does it anyway because he thinks it's good for the country. And what more could we ask from our leaders than putting the good of the country ahead of himself or herself?
Well, I was talking about books about presidents, and one might be very surprised in our audience to know that you are also a writer of fiction, a writer of murder mysteries. I believe there's actually 8 of them. And they have some pretty cool titles, actually, which you might want to mention. I'm always amazed at people that I meet when they have so many facets, so many sides to them. Okay? So now we're going from all these things we've talked about to writing mystery novels. How did you get into that, and what turned you on about that?
Well, you had asked me earlier about growing up, and I talked a little bit about my dad. My mom was a great reader. She loved to read, and even when I was growing up, we would set certain time of the day in the summertime aside for reading, and she would read her books. She loved mysteries, so she read mystery novels sometimes. But she also read Ellery Queen magazine. She loved the short stories in there. And at a certain point in time, I started to read mysteries too. I started out with Encyclopedia Brown and Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and Trixie Belden and all of those. And I just continued reading mysteries, especially when I was in graduate school, when I was trying to work on my dissertation. Things were kind of stressful. At the end of the day, I would open up a mystery, and I just like to read it because it let my mind wander. And I just continued to do that even as later on in life. And the true story was I was working at the Library of Congress, and I took a walk one day in my neighborhood before going to work, which I do all the time. And for some reason, my mind wandered that day. I was thinking about a book I think I had just finished, and I thought, well, if I was going to write a mystery novel, what would I write about? What would the plot be, or what would the setting be? And during that walk, that 45-minute walk around my neighborhood, I came up with the basic plot of my first book, Stabbing in the Senate, with the protagonist, the amateur sleuth that would solve the crime, who would get murdered, what the suspects would be, just the basic gist of it. And the smart thing that I did when I got home was that I wrote it down. I didn't just say, oh, whatever. I took a piece of paper and I just jotted it down and wrote down all the details that I had thought of. And I think a few weeks later, I told my husband about it, and he said, you should write that book. He said, that's a great idea. He said, that's a great title. He said, that's terrific. He said, only you can write that book, because I had worked in the Senate previously before I came to the Library of Congress. And I said, well, I've never written fiction before in my life. I'd written nonfiction, but I'd never written fiction. He said, you read all the time. You can do it. So I just sat down one day and I just started writing. And, I had a whole bunch of mystery novels around. So I would consult them and look at them and say, well, how do they do this? Like, when do you introduce the first suspect, and how much dialogue versus description? And so I would just consult the books when I needed to figure things out, or if I didn't know how to go about something, I would Google it. I mean, there's the internet's there for a reason. And it took me a while on that first one. It took me, I think, close to 2 years to actually write that first book. But then once that was done and I was able to, I went out and found an agent, and that one got published. And I thought it would just be one and done, but that's not really how mystery contracts work. When you're working with a publisher, the minimum really is 3 if you're going to have a recurring character, and they want a recurring character. So 1 turned into 3, and then 3 turned into 6, and then 6 turned into 8. And I just ended up writing one every year after that. And I would write in the evenings when I would come home from work, like maybe for an hour at a time. And I wrote as much as I could on the weekends, and any vacation or any time off, I would try to set time for writing.
We've got more leadership lessons for you after this break.
Llegaron los nuevos McCrispy Strips, listos para aventurarse en la mezcla de mayo ketchup, la barbecue que quedó en el fondo de la cajita, hot fudge sundae y en la nueva creamy chili McCrispy Strip dip. Los nuevos McCrispy Strips, ahora en McDonald's. Para pa pa pa.
Was it a form of therapy?
Yeah, probably.
An escape. Again, one of our 32 essentials is find time to escape. Because leaders always have stress. There's going to be sometimes a lot of stress. And one of the ways to handle it is just to forget about all of that and go play a round of golf, or go read a book, or write a book, I guess. Mm-hmm. In this case, hopefully you made a little money on this. Mm-hmm. So your escape turned out to be profitable, which is pretty rare, actually. I think at least none of my escapes have been profitable. But
it was an escape, because I think I had created this whole other fictional world. And the great thing about writing and writing fiction is that you're in control of that world. So if you don't like how a conversation is going, you can end it, or you can take it in a different direction. Or if you end up not liking a character, you can get rid of it. Almost always. I had one character, this is a true story, that was in Stabbing in the Senate, and I found him very annoying, but I made him on purpose annoying because, you need to have that type of tension in a book. He was funny too, because he was so annoying. And I thought that would be it for him. I mean, that other characters would move on in the next book, but he was not going to move on. And my editor said, oh no, he has to move on. He's great, and so he stayed for all 8 books. I made him a little bit less annoying as time went on. He learned some things. It was fun.
That's great. Is there one defining moment in your life? And this is a very hard question, and I don't ask it of everybody because it is so hard. I'm not even sure I can answer it for myself. So I'm telling you up front, this is an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I sense your answer might be kind of interesting. One defining career moment in your life where you had an epiphany, or just knew, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, or I can be good at it, or something went well, and then you were ready to move on to the next. Or maybe you met someone who influenced you tremendously as a mentor. In my case, I was very lucky at certain times to have people who believed in me more than I believed in myself. And I wasn't lacking confidence, but pushed me to go after goals and heights that I never would have considered myself. And they worked out. So maybe you had an experience like that. But I know it's a tough question.
It is a tough question. I mean, maybe for me, before I came to the archives, I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2021, and in late 2021, I caught very early, so that was good, but it was an aggressive form. So I had to have a lot of treatment. I had surgery, I had chemotherapy, I had radiation, I had immunotherapy, I had the whole shebang. And I think after I went through that and I got through that, I kind of felt like I could do anything. So to tell you the truth. And so a lot of people asked me during like my Senate confirmation hearings when there were people who were, saying ridiculous things and yelling at me, senators, and, not treating me the way that probably you would expect a presidential nominee to be treated. I would say in some cases treated unfairly. How were you able to sit there and take that? How did you get through that? How did you kind of just stare them down and just move on? Especially because I had to have 2 hearings because my nomination, I had to be renominated into a new cycle. And the answer to that, when I think about it, was really because things happen for a reason, and things happen oftentimes for a reason in sequence to each other. And the fact that I had went through what I went through with breast cancer, when you go through something like that, nothing scares you. And you're living a whole new life, right? Because you've gotten a second lease on life. And because of that, I felt as though when I was nominated to be the archivist, that this was my path. Like this was meant to happen. I was meant to be diagnosed early, to get through everything. And I was meant to go through it. And so nobody was going to deter me. And nobody ended up deterring me getting through it.
That's great.
And so that taught me a lot.
Good for you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the great things about effective leaders is they always seem to be able to bounce back. And I'll say not effective leaders, great leaders, always able to bounce back from setbacks. It doesn't seem to bother them. So now, okay, you had a recent setback in that suddenly you were out of a job for no reason that had anything to do with you. How did you bounce back? What are you doing today? What's your life like?
Well, it took a few weeks, to think about things. But then the phone did start to ring, and there were people who had seen what I had done at the archives, so that was nice, and they'd appreciated my leadership. So I had an offer to work for an organization called More Perfect. It is run by a man named John Bridgeland, who worked for President Bush, who ran USA Freedom Corps and was the head of his domestic policy council for President George W. Bush. And he started this umbrella organization, More Perfect, that is a collection of presidential centers and foundations and other organizations that are interested in strengthening American democracy. And he has 5 different pillars of American democracy for More Perfect that he's trying to work on. And the pillar that I'm working on at More Perfect is to improve civics education and history education. So we have a new history-based civics program that we're going to be enrolling in 2026. And it consists of gathering short essays, very short essays, 1,200 words, from some of our most prominent historians and thought leaders across the United States about all of our presidents and select first ladies. So why did this leader matter in American history? And what is one lesson we can learn from this leader? Right. And I'm in the process right now of recruiting people to write for this really important civics project, which we will be splashing all over the place in 2026, have those essays available, have them ready for schools, and then work with some media distribution to get them out there for Americans to consume.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for being on.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. I always enjoy it when I learn some new things about people, particularly people I think I've got pegged. I'll share with you, I did not have you pegged at all. And that makes it, which happens with just about all of our guests anyway. But I want to thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think the story of your journey throughout life is really fascinating and should be very inspiring to not just women, but everybody, all Americans.
Thanks so much.
In particular, and best of luck to you in the future.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, and we'll stay in touch. Thanks, Colleen.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Superhero Leadership. I want to thank Dr. Colleen Shogan for sharing her insights and experiences, and I hope you'll join me again next time. Until then, stay focused, stay driven, and keep leading like a superhero with purpose, passion, and integrity. I'm Peter Cuneo.